Europe is killing its companies. On the 9th of September, Mario Draghi released his much-anticipated report on European competitiveness. It aims to be a blueprint for fixing the European economy and its model. At 400 pages, it provides a comprehensive assessment of Europe's economic challenges, but it also means that everybody will take a different message out of it. The frugal Northern European countries are already fuming at the idea of collective borrowing or collective debt to finance European competitiveness. The Euro bubble in Brussels felt validated by the recommendations to centralize the EU and give it the ability to act, while skeptics have criticized it for its recommendations to increase the public spending that they think got Europe in its current economic mess. There is something for everyone to like and something for everyone to hate. I read the report to try and give you as comprehensive of an overview of what it actually is, as well as the main takeaways. So what does the Draghi report say about the European economy? What are some of Mario Draghi's solutions to fix it? And what are the unanswered questions left by this report? So Draghi's assessment is first one about the decline of the European economy, with a falling share of global GDP, a falling share of trade, which was mostly caused by lagging productivity. Draghi points out early on in his report that the main gap in productivity is due to lagging digitalization in Europe. While productivity in the EU grew just as fast in the US in most sectors, it lacked the digital sector, which has driven up American productivity growth. As a result of this lagging productivity, disposable income in the United States has grown by almost twice as much in the US than in the EU over the past 2 decades. And the foundations on which European prosperity was built have disappeared, whether it be in terms of energy, security, or sources of growth. The continent no longer has access to cheap energy in the form of Russian gas. Its export-dependent economy is facing an increasingly protectionist global environment, with more countries passing anti-trade legislation. And finally, Chinese subsidized manufacturing and tech domination is driving European firms out of industries that they have historically dominated, like the automotive sector. While they face all these challenges, European countries are reacting to this new environment in a fragmented way, whether it be financing, industrial standards, and policy priorities, which decrease the overall effectiveness of their funding. Mario Draghi then went on to say that if Europe is unable to reform and tackle these problems, then it will face slow agony as its economy becomes increasingly insignificant in the world. And Mr. Draghi goes on to point out that Europe must reform from a position of weakness and vulnerability. Europe has an aging population, a big dependency on foreign trade and energy imports, which limits how aggressive it can be in its trade policy. Mario Draghi's report then goes on to point out the self-inflicted wounds created by European countries. When it comes to climate policy, Europe previously attempted to separate it from trade policy. As a result, the Green Deal has focused on the energy transition, but not on the creation of jobs and industries, which has resulted and continues to result in deindustrialization. This has allowed foreign producers, most notably China, to take over and dominate certain markets like solar. While the EU is still a leader in many clean tech domains, there is no guarantee that EU demand for clean tech will be met by EU supply, given increasing Chinese capacity and scale. But in order to face that, Europe needs to tackle its energy problems. Because when it comes to energy, Europe's model is undermined by its dependency on natural gas, which it mostly imported from Russia and which sets electricity prices. This put pressure on European businesses, particularly its energy-intensive businesses in the chemical and metallurgical industries. But in general, industrial electricity prices are 3 times higher than in the United States, most notably driven by fuel, operation, and maintenance costs, but also partially driven by taxes and carbon pricing. These difficulties in energy are compounded by an investment gap. Few European countries have pension funds with which they can invest in the European economy. It has no unified capital markets to allow cross-border investment, and investment is dependent on risk-averse banks. And due to lower levels of wealth, it has fewer venture capitalists and private investors than in the United States. And this investment gap leads in turn to an innovation gap with the US due to a lack of funding and the inability to commercialize inventions into valuable products. Europe has fewer people engaged in STEM education, Europe educational scores are falling, and while European education is generally good, it isn't excellent. European universities are good, but few achieve excellence or make it to the top 50 worldwide. The EU only has 3 research institutions ranked among the top 50 globally, whereas the US has 21 and China 15. Research budgets are fragmented over the continent, and few inventors turn into entrepreneurs. Those that do face an uphill battle for their businesses. This is compounded by excessive regulation. The EU's regulatory stance towards tech companies hampers innovation. It now has around 100 tech-focused laws and 270 regulators active in digital networks across all member states. And when it comes to trade-offs between consumers' rights to privacy and business efficiency, the EU has nearly always chosen consumers. This is a fair assessment of the current position of Europe and the European Union. And while we could dive into the numbers some more, it has been the subject of many videos I have made in the past with Into Europe, whether it be Europe's Silicon Valleys, the decline of the German solar industry, the deindustrialization of Europe, or an upcoming video on why it's so difficult to start a business in the EU. So what are then Mr. Draghi's solutions and the 3 key takeaways from the reports to fix the European economy? So I won't look at all the solutions of the Draghi report, simply for the fact that a good chunk of this is allocated to individual sectors like energy, AI, or the automotive sector, which could be the content of an entirely different video. And while energy is important for most of the European economy and can be seen as having a general impact, it's something I have covered in the past already. Instead, I focused on what the report calls the horizontal policies meant to address the structural challenges faced by the European economy. This includes things like dealing with unfair trading practices, closing the investment gap, and dealing with the lack of excellence. The first way that the report proposes to deal with Europe's problems is by taking a page from China's handbook. The Draghi report identifies 4 types of industries and sectors for European countries and corresponding courses of action. First, there are industries that are considered lost, where European countries are so far behind that only an expensive subsidy campaign could help them regain it. These include sectors like solar, but also some cloud services, where Europe should simply accept from imports because the cost of developing things once again would be prohibitive. Second, there are industries that Europe wants to have but doesn't need to own the intellectual property for, but has a strategic interest in domestic production. This includes things for EVs, where European countries like Germany and Hungary have received American and Chinese car factories. Third are sectors where European countries want to develop a knowledge base. Here, Draghi calls for the development of joint ventures, where foreign companies would have to find a local European partner with which to invest. This is, by the way, the model that China had developed to extract intellectual property from Western companies, something it has done with Airbus, but also European and American auto manufacturers. And finally, a 4th category for infant industries, areas where the EU should try to develop new actors from the ground up and protect them temporarily, but also for as long as needed. This marks the return of industrial policy, something that the EU has been talking about for the past 4 years, and to end the naive approach to European trade. The second way that the Draghi report wants to help the European economy is by tackling the investment and innovation gap. In order to meet the industrial objectives linked to the green transition, Draghi expects a minimum annual additional investment of 750 to 800 billion euros a year. This is close to 5% of the EU's GDP and more than twice the amount that was spent by the Marshall Plan. This funding is essential to innovation and business ventures. And to do this, Draghi advocates for the completion of long-discussed EU initiatives, the Capital Markets Union and the Banking Union. But because the report estimates that the additional private funding that these 2 initiatives will generate won't be enough, it advocates for direct public investment representing 1/5 to 50% of the total package. And so to reach that goal, Mr. Draghi recommends increasing public spending through common debt for EU projects. And finally, the third main point of the report is to reform the EU to be more flexible and remove excessive regulation. In his press conference, Mario Draghi pointed to the responsibility of the EU's precautionary principle for being the source of much of the EU's legislation.
Many of these laws take a precautionary approach, dictating specific business practices ex ante to avert potential yet undetermined risks.
EU legislation should take into account a phenomenon, product, or process that may have a dangerous effect, identified by a scientific and objective evaluation, even if this evaluation doesn't allow risk to be determined with sufficient clarity. This principle is, in Mario Draghi's own words,
we are killing our companies.
Just to give a couple of examples, the GDPR, the EU's signature data protection regulation, reduced small European tech companies' profits by 15%. In a similar fashion, the EU implemented the AI Act before AI was even that big, priding itself on regulating things that didn't exist yet. So to tackle this, the report suggests removing excessive bureaucracy and damaging legislation. It suggests that law packages should have impact assessments before being passed, and that the EU evaluate the impact of policies after they're passed, which is something that is surprisingly not being done at the moment. This would also help with another problem, the so-called gold plating of EU legislation, where member states make regulations stricter than is needed or asked for by EU legislation, which leads to less harmonization, which is the entire point of EU legislation. In fact, one of the more concrete proposals is a commissioner to simplify EU regulation and make sure that existing EU regulation is coherently adopted across the bloc. And that's basically the initial job of the EU, with initiatives like the Banking Union, the Capital Markets Union, or the completion of the single market being the most prominent features of the report. And these might justify giving some additional powers to the EU to help eliminate barriers between countries and create a level playing field for companies. And finally, in order to make this legislation more effective and move more rapidly, Mr. Draghi suggests increasing EU efficiency through more political centralization. The main way he suggests to do this is by extending qualified majority voting, so that laws can pass if 55% of countries representing 65% of the EU population agree, instead of unanimity. This would reduce the 18 months it currently takes for EU legislation to pass, and would allow the EU to be more effective at taking decisions and avoid legislation being diluted by opposition from a single EU country. So, all in all, the report's suggestions and proposals are about more funding, less regulation, and being less naive in the world. All points that are hard to argue against. And while Mr. Draghi proposes several solutions, for me this report does leave important unanswered questions and several contradictions when it comes to European competitiveness. For that, I have to lean more into opinion rather than the journalism I'm more accustomed to on this channel. The first question is whether debt-driven EU funding should even be used. Well, Mario Draghi suggested the need for 800 billion euros in public and private investment per year, and that the EU should be able to borrow money to help incentivize private investors. According to Draghi's own estimates, this would mean between 80 to 400 billion euros in investment coming from public spending. This would allow the EU to coordinate how that money is spent, one of the key sticking points of the Draghi report when it comes to current European funding efforts, and allow it to fund a coherent industrial policy while at the same time avoiding the poor southern European countries from falling behind. Unsurprisingly, this has faced objections from the German and Dutch government. But to be fair, the fears of frugal northern European countries aren't unfounded, which fear a permanent transfer union where richer EU countries support the poorer ones. Giving more spending power to the EU means holding it accountable for funding productive investments, especially when you consider the limited impacts of next-gen EU funds. The package of funds granted by the European Union during the COVID pandemic to avoid a recession, modernize and digitalize the European economy, and kickstart growth. And while it helped avoid a European recession, it resulted only in GDP growth of a fraction of a percent, which, as you can guess, falls short of the productivity gains needed to pay back the borrowed money. And there's no guarantee that this money will be spent well. Italy, for example, spent 100 billion euros it received on the so-called super bonus scheme, which reimbursed people for 110% of their housing renovations. To make matters more complicated, EU members still haven't agreed how they would pay back the money that they collectively borrowed. While the EU and Europe probably need this borrowing and additional spending, it would imply higher contributions from EU members, which would likely have to be paid for with additional taxation. And in another problem, the report doesn't stop to ask why there's such a big gap in investment in the first place. In other words, why there isn't more private funding available in Europe. And this has to do with the main taboo of the report, Europe's social model and its cost on the European economy. In the first pages of the report, it's made abundantly clear that Europe's social model, in other words, the welfare state, is sacred and off limits, which is not something you would expect to hear when this situation is apparently so dire. So why is the European social model a problem when it comes to investment? Well, if we simplify very roughly the economic setup of China, the US, and Europe, we can see that there is a problem with the competitiveness of the European model. In the Chinese model, depressed wages for lower-skilled workers allows the state to generate surpluses that it can then invest into its manufacturing industry. In the US model, wealth inequality allows for capital accumulation that can be reinvested into the economy and in recruiting top talent. In the European model, we have government pensions and universal healthcare, but no surplus that can be reinvested. Part of this is to Europe's credit. It's less exploitative, more humane and egalitarian, but it also means it doesn't generate the economic surplus to raise the investment. High taxes across the board reduce the ability for people to save and invest, creating a problem which it then attempts to fix with more of the cause of the problem, public spending financed with debt and indirectly taxes. In fact, the report has this one short paragraph about the success of the Swedish model and how it should inspire Europe. And I mean, this is a fair point. Sweden's economy is doing relatively well in terms of innovation, has a highly skilled workforce paid for by high taxes. But just saying "be like Sweden" is hardly a policy proposal, and it ignores the fact that Sweden had to roll back some of its social model in the 1990s, after high taxes and an oversized public sector reduced private businesses and tanked the country's competitiveness. The question of how much welfare and public spending Europeans can afford while still remaining competitive is entirely absent from the report and the public debate. As a result, public spending is seen as a magical bullet which would solve Europe's problems. But it mostly ignores the fact that it would eventually have to pay back by taxes, which are already the highest in the world in Europe. But this isn't the only contradiction, because when it comes to talent, how can the EU excel when it refuses to pay for it? According to the report, to succeed, Europe needs excellence in research at its companies, in its universities and education systems. And it needs more investment in its economy, much of which comes from the private sector. Draghi wants more educational institutions in the top 50, attracting top talent, more new businesses, and more people focusing on innovation. The report sees this as the key to its competitiveness, but then Europe refuses to actually create the conditions where this excellence can emerge and be rewarded. One of the main fears of this report is that Europe would devolve into the American model, which is characterized by high wealth inequality, which is diametrically opposed to Europe's social model. But inequality and the higher salaries it allows can be useful and morally justifiable, especially when it comes to attracting people in the global competition for talent. I previously made a video on Europe's brain drain and struggle to attract global talent. And one of the main challenges facing Europe that I found was the low salaries of highly skilled Europeans relative to the rest of the world. It's a contradiction that the report offers no answer to. But all in all, Mario Draghi's report offers a clear analysis of Europe's problems and offers some solutions, especially on the international trade and industrial policy level, that would result in the EU being less naive and more assertive and promote its interests, and that it needs to invest unprecedented amounts to get its act together. It provides a welcome break from the past, but we will have to see how this is reflected in EU policy in the coming years. But the main issue I have with this assessment is that it doesn't even mention the costs of Europe's social model, which means it's impossible to have a conversation on the subject. To be fair, this isn't something for the European debate. Tax policy is a topic for national politics. But the fact that the social model is seen as off limits and the cost in the form of high taxation isn't even discussed in the assessment of Europe's weaknesses is like hiding half of the story of Europe's economic decline. And to be frank, it's hard to justify the EU spending more public money when you don't even have the answer to why Europe has so little private investment and so few investors in the first place. By sacralizing the European social model, this report refuses to see that if Europeans don't give up on some things, then they may lose everything. And what do you think European countries and the European Union should do to address the slow agony they're faced with? Do you want to see more videos on the future of European industry? Then let me know in the comments down below. If you like this video, then you can already watch a video that I made on a related subject on Patreon about the challenges facing Europeans when starting and scaling a business. It talks about some of the points that I found were lacking in the Draghi report, most notably the cost of Europe's social model. It's currently only available for paid supporters. If you can't wait that long or just want to support the channel, then go check it out. Over the past couple months, I started a crowdfunding campaign in order to be able to raise 700 euros a month to rent and build a studio for recording videos. And after so many of you joined after my Economics of Immigration video, we're currently a little more than 40% there. So go check it out with the link down below.